That morning, Ryan Carter had one last ride before his shift at the office. The girl in his back seat was so drunk she couldn't remember her own address. It took him nearly an hour of quiet back and forth before he finally pulled up to a gated beachfront estate. When the front door opened, he went still. The woman standing in the doorway wasn't a housekeeper or a relative. It was Evelyn Brooks, the new president who had just taken over the company where he worked. And the drunk girl he'd just driven home was her daughter. Ryan Carter had been driving since 4 in the morning. Not because he wanted to, but because the overnight delivery route he'd picked up paid an extra $40 on top of the base rate, and $40 was $40. By the time he finished that run and got back to his apartment to change, he had maybe 20 minutes before he needed to be behind the wheel again, this time for a rideshare pickup on the east side of the city. He told himself it was just one more ride. He told himself that every morning. The request came in at 5:47, a pickup location near a bar district, which wasn't unusual for early morning. What was unusual was that when he pulled up and saw the girl leaning against a concrete planter outside, he almost didn't stop. She looked like she could barely hold herself upright, one hand gripping the edge of the planter, the other hanging loose at her side. She was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a dress that looked expensive and a pair of heels that were now in her hand rather than on her feet. Ryan sat in the car for a moment watching. He'd seen this before. He knew how these rides could go, but he pulled over anyway. He got out and opened the back door. The girl looked up at him with the unfocused eyes of someone who had been drinking for several hours without stopping. She said something that was close to a thank you and lowered herself into the seat. Ryan closed the door, got back behind the wheel, and waited. After a moment, he asked for her destination. She looked at her phone for a long time, then said she couldn't remember her address. Not the street name, not the neighborhood, nothing. Ryan asked if there was someone he could call. She said her phone was almost dead, and she didn't have anyone's number memorized. He asked her name. She said Chloe. He drove slowly toward the edge of the bar district and asked her questions, not interrogating her, just talking. Did she know what part of the city she lived in? Was it near the water? Did she take the highway to get home? Usually, Chloe answered in fragments, some useful, most not. But slowly, over the course of nearly an hour, Ryan pieced together enough. She mentioned a gate. She mentioned the smell of salt air in the morning. She said her bedroom window faced the ocean. Ryan drove toward the coast. When they reached the beachfront area, something in Chloe shifted. She sat up, a little, looked out the window, and said quietly that it looked familiar. Ryan turned down 2 more streets until she told him to stop. The house behind the iron gate was large, not the kind of large that was showy, but the kind that was simply expensive in every detail. Stone driveway, manicured hedges, exterior lighting that stayed on all night. Ryan pulled up to the intercom, and Chloe leaned forward and pressed the button herself. After a moment, the gate opened. He drove her up to the front entrance. He got out and opened her door and helped her to the steps because she still wasn't entirely steady. The front door opened before they reached it. The woman standing in the doorway was somewhere in her late 40s, dressed already composed in the way that suggested she hadn't slept much, but wasn't going to let it show. She looked at her daughter first, then at Ryan. There was no warmth in her expression, but there was no hostility either. Just the flat, evaluating look of someone who was processing information before deciding what to do with it. Ryan said he was the rideshare driver. He said Chloe hadn't remembered her address, and that it had taken them a while to find the place. He said he just wanted to make sure she got inside safely. The woman gave a single nod and said, "Thank you." 2 words, nothing more. Ryan turned and walked back to his car. He didn't look back. He had a shift to get to. He made it to the office with 4 minutes to spare. He changed his shirt in the parking garage, ate a granola bar standing next to his car, and took the elevator up to the operations floor. The work was steady that day. Root planning a vendor dispute that needed mediating a backlog in the Western Distribution Center that no one had flagged until it became a problem. Ryan handled it the way he always did, methodically, without drama, in the order things needed to be done. By the time the day was half over, he had mostly forgotten about the morning. Then the afternoon meeting happened. The announcement had been circulating for 2 weeks. The company had new ownership, and the incoming executive would be addressing the senior staff in person. Ryan had read the memo and moved on. He didn't follow corporate restructuring closely, because it rarely changed what his actual job looked like on a day-to-day basis. He showed up to the meeting because attendance was required, took a seat near the back of the conference room and waited. When the door opened and the woman walked in, Ryan went still. It was her. The woman from the doorway that morning. The composed face, the exact same posture, the same quality of presence that made the room adjust to her rather than the other way around. She set a folder on the table at the head of the room and looked out at the assembled staff without any particular expression. Then she said her name. Evelyn Brooks, new president and executive chair. She said she was looking forward to working with the team and that there would be a transition review in the coming weeks. She spoke for 11 minutes. She answered 3 questions. And then she left the room the same way she entered, without any visible investment in how the room had received her. Ryan sat in his chair after everyone else had started filing out. His mind was working through what had just happened. The woman he had spoken to on a doorstep at 6 in the morning was now the person his entire division reported to. The girl in his car, Chloe, was her daughter. He hadn't done anything wrong. He knew that. But he also knew how it looked, and how it could be made to look if anyone wanted to make something of it. He decided the best thing to do was nothing. Keep his head down, do his job, and let the morning stay in the past where it belonged. That worked for about a week. Evelyn Brooks moved through the company the way someone does when they already know what they're looking for. She didn't make noise. She didn't hold a lot of long meetings. She walked floor, sat in on operations, calls, asked direct questions, and wrote things down. Ryan noticed she was in the building earlier than most, and left later than all of them. He noticed because he was usually one of the last people out himself, though, for different reasons. She came to the operations floor on a Wednesday. She sat in on a routing review that Ryan was leading, and didn't say a word for the first 40 minutes. At the end, she asked 2 questions, both of them precise, both of them about decisions Ryan had made earlier in the quarter that weren't reflected in the current workflow. He answered them honestly. She wrote something down and left without comment. He told himself it meant nothing. She was reviewing every department. He was just another manager in the rotation. But she came back the following week, and the week after that. Ryan noticed that she never came to the operations floor when the rest of the senior leadership was present. She came in the late afternoon, usually after the larger meetings had cleared out. She would position herself somewhere unobtrusive, a chair near the window, the edge of the room, and watch how the work actually happened, rather than how it was presented. Once, she stayed long enough to see Ryan take a call from a driver whose truck had broken down on the interstate 200 miles out. Ryan spent 20 minutes on the phone coordinating a replacement vehicle, a schedule adjustment, and a call to the client to reset delivery expectations all at the same time. When he looked up after he hung up, Evelyn was still there. She said nothing, but she didn't write anything down that time either. She just left. What Ryan didn't know, and wouldn't know until much later, was that Evelyn had already pulled his file. Not because she suspected anything, but because she had seen something in that doorway at 6 in the morning that she couldn't quite account for, and she was a person who needed to account for things. The man who had spent an hour driving her barely conscious daughter across the city, who had walked Chloe to the door and then turned around and left without asking for anything, that man had shown up the same morning to a full workday without a trace of complaint or expectation on his face. She had been in enough rooms with enough people to know that kind of behavior was not common. His file told her what the visible signs had already suggested. Ryan Carter had been with the company for 6 years, consistently strong performance reviews, multiple commendations from the logistics teams he managed, no written complaints, no disciplinary record. He had turned down a regional director position twice, once 3 years ago, once 8 months ago. Both times his reason listed was scheduling constraints. The HR notes were brief, but they noted that he had declined without explanation and that follow-up had not been pursued. Evelyn read that twice. Scheduling constraints, from a man who was working rideshare shifts at 5 in the morning. She didn't go to him directly. She was careful about the distance that existed between her position and his, and she had no interest in creating a situation that could be misread. But she paid attention. When he left the office each evening, all was on time, never 5 minutes late, never staying past his hours the way middle managers often do when they're trying to be seen. She noticed which direction he went, and how quickly. There was a purposefulness to it. He wasn't leaving because he was disengaged. He was leaving because he had somewhere to be. Ryan, for his part, had made a decision that he was going to treat Evelyn Brooks exactly the same way he treated any other executive professionally, efficiently, and with as little personal content as possible. He answered her questions when she asked them. He prepared thorough documentation for her review cycles. He was not cold to her, but he was not warm either. He was simply competent, and he relied on that being enough. What made this harder than he expected was that she was, in fact, a good executive. Not in the performative sense, not in the way that some leaders were good at looking like leaders. She understood operations at a structural level. When she asked a question, it was because she had already identified a problem and wanted to know if he had too. When she challenged a decision he'd made, she was almost always right, and she delivered the challenge without condescension, which was rarer than it should have been at her level. He found himself more than once genuinely engaged in a conversation with her before he remembered who she was and pulled back. He kept pulling back, every time, because the thing about Ryan Carter was that he had learned through several hard lessons what happened when you let your guard down at work. He had seen colleagues mistake a supervisor's interest for genuine friendship and end up blindsided when the professional calculus shifted. He had been on the wrong side of that kind of miscalculation himself earlier in his career, and the lesson had settled into him like something permanent. He didn't mix personal and professional. He didn't share more than was necessary. He kept the two halves of his life, the office, and everything outside it, completely separate. The problem was that the two halves had already met on a doorstep at dawn before he'd had any chance to enforce that boundary. By the end of the first month of Evelyn's tenure, Ryan had developed a quiet, functional understanding of how to navigate her presence in the building. He was respectful. He was useful. He was never anything that could be called familiar. And every evening he drove out of the parking garage, switched on the rideshare app and took whatever came in, because his father's medical bills didn't care about his workday, and the debt collector didn't call during business hours just to be polite. He had 3 jobs and 8 hours of sleep to divide between them, and he had been doing this for long enough that he no longer thought of it as a crisis. It was just the shape of his life. You worked with the shape you had. What he hadn't accounted for was Chloe. He got a text message from an unknown number on a Thursday afternoon. The message was short. It said it was Chloe Brooks, that she'd gotten his number from the rideshare app's contact feature before deleting the request, and that she wanted to thank him properly for what he'd done a few weeks ago. She said she would understand if he preferred not to respond. Ryan read it twice. He thought about what the right answer was given everything. Then he typed back a single line. He said she didn't need to thank him, but that he was glad she was okay. He hit send and went back to his routing spreadsheet. She replied 4 minutes later. She said she knew she didn't have to, but that she wanted to. She asked if they could talk sometime, not about anything heavy, just a conversation. Ryan looked at that message for a long moment. He knew what the cautious move was. He also knew that refusing would be its own kind of statement, one that could be read in different ways by different people. He agreed to a brief conversation during his lunch break the following week. What he didn't know was that Evelyn would find out about it, and that it would change what she understood about him completely. The lunch conversation happened on a Tuesday in a small cafe 2 blocks from the office building. Ryan arrived, first ordered coffee, and sat facing the door. Chloe came in 5 minutes later, and she looked entirely different from the last time he'd seen her, which admittedly wasn't a high bar. She was composed, dressed simply, and carried herself with the careful quietness of someone who had recently been embarrassed and hadn't fully decided how to handle it yet. She sat down across from him, ordered water, and said the first thing directly she was sorry for the trouble she'd caused that morning. Ryan told her there was no trouble. She had needed a ride, and he had given her one. That was the whole of it. Chloe looked at him the way people do when they expect someone to soften a judgment and are surprised to find there isn't one. She said most drivers would have dropped her at the nearest safe location and canceled the ride. Ryan said he probably should have from a practical standpoint, but that she hadn't looked like she was in a condition to manage on her own, so he hadn't. Chloe was quiet for a moment after that, turning her water glass slowly in her hands. She said she'd been having a difficult stretch. Not an excuse, she added quickly, just context. Ryan nodded and didn't push for more, which seemed to settle something in her. The conversation moved to lighter ground. After that, the neighborhood, the coffee, the general state of the city's traffic. They talked for about 25 minutes. When Ryan stood to leave, Chloe thanked him again, and this time he accepted it without deflecting. He walked back to the office with 2 minutes left of his lunch break and didn't think much about it for the rest of the afternoon. What he didn't know was that Chloe had mentioned the meeting to her mother that evening. She hadn't said anything detailed. She'd simply told Evelyn that she had spoken with the driver, that she'd wanted to thank him properly, and that he had been decent about it. No strange energy, no expectation. Evelyn had listened without reacting the way she listened to most things. But later that night, alone in her home office, with a half-empty glass of water and a quarterly report she wasn't really reading, she found herself thinking about what Chloe had said. Decent. No expectation. She set the report down. She had spent her entire career learning how to read people quickly, because in her world, reading people slowly was a liability. And the picture of Ryan Carter that had been assembling itself in her mind over the past several weeks was one that didn't fit neatly into any category she trusted. He was not trying to impress her. He was not angling for anything. He came to work exhausted and performed at a level that most of her rested, comfortable managers couldn't match. He had turned down promotions, not out of lack of ambition, but because something outside the office demanded his time and energy, and whatever that something was, he had chosen to manage it alone rather than use it as leverage. In Evelyn's experience, people either hid their struggles to avoid appearing weak or displayed them to generate sympathy. Ryan Carter appeared to be doing neither. He was just carrying his weight and expecting no acknowledgement for it. That more than anything else was what she couldn't stop thinking about. The following Thursday, Evelyn stopped by the operations floor at the end of the day. Ryan was the only manager still at his desk, something she had come to expect. She set a folder on the table beside him, not on his desk, but adjacent to it, as though she hadn't quite committed to staying. She said she had a question about the Western distribution backlog and wanted his read on the root cause. Ryan pulled up the relevant data and walked her through it in about 4 minutes. She asked 2 follow-up questions, both of which he answered without hesitation. Then she said, it wasn't the data she was asking about. It was the decision-making pattern. Why did this particular failure point keep recurring across quarters when it had been flagged multiple times? Ryan leaned back in his chair and told her the honest version: the team leads in that region were competent but under-resourced, and the people above them kept approving headcount reductions at budget time because the problems never fully collapsed. They just degraded slowly enough that no one wanted to make the case for intervention. He said it was easier to tolerate a consistent low-level failure than to fund a fix, and that the company had been making that calculation for at least 3 years. Evelyn wrote something down. She asked why he hadn't escalated it formally. Ryan said he had twice in writing, and that both times the recommendation had been acknowledged and filed. Evelyn looked at the folder in front of her without opening it. Then she said, "I'll look at those filings." She picked up the folder and left. Ryan watched her go, and then turned back to his screen. He was not sure what had just happened, but it felt like something. It was Chloe who gave him the peace he was missing, though not intentionally. They had begun exchanging occasional text messages, nothing frequent, nothing personal. Just the kind of low-stakes back and forth that happens when two people have had an honest conversation, and neither one has made it strange. Chloe asked him once how he managed to stay even-keeled at work when things got difficult. Ryan said he'd had a lot of practice. She asked what he meant. He wrote back something brief that he'd had enough going on outside of work for long enough that the office problems rarely felt like the worst thing in front of him on any given day. Chloe sent back a single question mark. Ryan almost left it there. Then, for a reason he couldn't entirely explain, he typed a few more lines. He told her about his father. Not the whole story, just the shape of it. The surgery 2 years ago, the complications that had extended the recovery, the bills that had accumulated past what insurance covered, and then kept going. He said he had 3 income streams running at once, and that it had been that way for a while, and that he had gotten used to it, the way you get used to most things that don't kill you. He sent the message, and immediately felt he'd said too much. Chloe replied an hour later. She said she hadn't known, and that she was sorry, and that it made the morning she'd put him through feel even worse in retrospect. Ryan told her to let it go. She said she was trying. What Ryan didn't know was that Chloe had shared that conversation with her mother, not word for word, and not immediately. But a few days later, during one of the brief dinners they managed, when Evelyn's schedule allowed it, Chloe mentioned that she'd learned why Ryan worked so many jobs. She said he was paying off medical debt from his father's surgery. She said he had been doing it for 2 years alone without telling anyone at work. Evelyn set down her fork. She asked Chloe how she had found that out. Chloe said he had told her himself in a message, and that he hadn't made it into a story, he'd just answered her question. Evelyn didn't say anything for the rest of the meal, but something had shifted in her face, and Chloe, who had been watching her mother's face for expressions of actual feeling, her entire life recognized it. The next week, things at the office changed in a way Ryan wasn't expecting. He had been considered for a project lead role on a new regional expansion initiative, one of the first major moves under Evelyn's restructuring. He hadn't applied for it. His name had apparently been put forward by someone in the senior team, though he didn't know who. The project was significant, a 6-month timeline, cross-departmental coordination, a direct reporting line to the executive office. It was exactly the kind of role he would have accepted, without a second thought, at a different point in his life. He read the briefing document twice, and then went to find his direct supervisor, a man named Dale Whitmore, to ask how his name had come up. Dale said it had come from above, and that he didn't have more detail than that. He said it was a good opportunity, and that Ryan should take it. Ryan asked what the time commitment looked like outside of standard hours. Dale said it would likely require some evenings and occasional weekend availability during crunch periods. Ryan thanked him and said he needed a few days to think about it. He did not take a few days. He knew by the time he got back to his desk that he couldn't do it, not without dropping one of his other jobs, and dropping one of his other jobs would leave a gap in what he owed each month that he couldn't close. He drafted a polite decline and sent it before the end of the day. He listed scheduling constraints as the same reason he had listed the 2 times before. He hit send and closed the email. What happened next started quietly, the way most things do before they become problems. 2 of the managers, who had also been considered for the project lead role, were senior to Ryan in title, though not in tenure. When the role had been offered to Ryan, someone below them on the org chart, they had been unhappy. When Ryan declined it, they were not relieved. They were angry in the particular way that people are when they feel a slight has been formalized and then withdrawn before they could respond to it properly. The fact that Ryan had turned it down didn't undo what his being offered it had implied about how his work was being valued versus theirs. Their names were Marcus Hale and Trevor Sands, and they had been with the company long enough to know how to be difficult without being visible about it. They began doing small things. A routing report that Ryan had submitted got attributed to a different team in a summary document. A process improvement he had documented got presented in a leadership meeting without his name attached. None of it was dramatic. None of it was the kind of thing that generated a formal complaint. It was the low friction of two people who had decided quietly that Ryan Carter needed to be managed down. Ryan noticed. He noticed the way someone notices a slow leak, not with alarm but with the steady recognition that something was losing pressure. He didn't say anything. He documented what he could, kept copies of his submissions, and kept his head down. He told himself it would settle on its own. Most things did. Then the rumors started. It began as something overheard in a hallway. Someone had said that Ryan was getting special attention from the new president because of a personal connection, and that the project offer had been a favor rather than a merit decision. By the end of the following week, the version circulating on the floor was more specific. People were saying that Ryan knew Evelyn Brooks before she took the position, that the morning rideshare story was either fabricated or more complicated than it seemed, and that his consistent presence on her visit rotations was not coincidence. Ryan heard a version of it secondhand from a colleague who told him in the awkward, apologetic way of someone delivering bad news they didn't generate. He sat with it overnight. He turned it over in his mind and looked at it from every angle, and what he kept arriving at was the same conclusion. It didn't matter whether the rumor was believed by everyone or just a few. What mattered was that it was now the frame through which some people were reading his work, and once that frame existed, it was very difficult to dismantle. Everything he did from that point forward could be filtered through it. Every good review, every strong project, every moment of visibility, all of it would be readable as the product of access rather than ability. He had spent 6 years building a reputation at this company, and 2 weeks of whisper campaign had put a question mark next to all of it. Ryan drafted a resignation letter. The work at a satellite branch had crossed his mind briefly, but he set that idea aside. A transfer wouldn't change the narrative, it would just relocate it. If he was going to remove himself from the situation cleanly, it had to be complete. He read the draft twice, made 2 small edits, and saved it. He didn't send it yet. He told himself he was waiting to see if things settled. But he had the draft ready, and on some level he already knew he was going to use it. Evelyn found out about the resignation letter before he sent it. Dale Whitmore had mentioned it to her directly. Not to create drama, but because he thought she should know that one of her strongest operations managers was preparing to leave entirely. Evelyn had thanked him and ended the conversation. Then she had gone to her office and closed the door, which was something she almost never did during working hours. She sat at her desk and looked out the window at the city below, and thought about what she had put in motion even without meaning to. Her attention had been genuine. Her interest in Ryan's work had been legitimate. None of that changed the fact that her proximity to him had handed his enemies a narrative, and he was now the one paying for it. She thought about calling him in. She thought about addressing it directly the way she addressed most things. But she understood in the particular way of someone who had been watched and discussed and evaluated by powerful people her entire career, that sometimes a direct intervention made the story larger rather than smaller. Ryan hadn't done anything wrong, and yet the most protective thing she could do for him right now might be to do nothing at all, which was not something Evelyn Brooks was accustomed to doing. She left the office that evening later than usual and drove home without taking any calls. Chloe was in the living room when she got back. Evelyn sat down across from her daughter and said plainly that she thought she had made things harder for someone who already had enough difficulty. Chloe looked at her for a moment and then asked what she was going to do about it. Evelyn said she didn't know yet. Chloe said that was the most honest thing she'd heard her mother say in years. Evelyn looked at her daughter and for the first time in a long time didn't have a response ready. Ryan sent the resignation letter on a Monday morning before the rest of the floor had come in. He had held the draft for 4 days, which was long enough to be certain it wasn't a reactive decision. He read it one final time, changed nothing, and hit send. Then he made coffee, sat down at his desk, and started his day the same way he always did, by checking the overnight routing reports and flagging anything that needed attention before the first call at 8. He did not feel relieved. He did not feel defeated. He felt the particular flatness of someone who has made the only reasonable decision available to them and is simply waiting for the paperwork to process. What he didn't expect was that the resignation would land in the middle of something that was already in motion. Evelyn had spent the previous week doing what she did with every problem she couldn't solve by instinct. She gathered information. She pulled the documentation trail on the Western Distribution Project, the one Ryan had flagged twice, in writing the one that had been filed and ignored. She cross-referenced submission timestamps, authorship records, and meeting notes from the past 2 months. The pattern she found was not subtle once she was looking for it. 2 names appeared consistently in the gaps between what Ryan had submitted and what had been presented upward: Marcus Hale and Trevor Sands. She didn't move immediately. She kept reading. The quarterly operations review was scheduled for that Wednesday. It was a full-floor meeting, all managers, all team. Leads the senior leadership team and Evelyn herself. These meetings had a standard format. Each department presented its numbers, flagged its issues, and outlined its forward plan. Evelyn had attended 2 of them since taking over. She had said very little at both. This time, she came in with a folder. Ryan sat in his usual seat toward the middle of the room. He had heard nothing back about the resignation, which was normal. These things took time to process. He had decided to treat the meeting the same way he treated everything else: do the work, say what was true, and leave without incident. His operations segment was scheduled 3rd. He had prepared a clean summary of the quarter and a forward projection that included, as it always did, a flagged concern about the Western Distribution staffing levels. Marcus Hale presented first. His segment was smooth, well-designed slides, confident delivery, the kind of presentation that looked polished because significant time had been spent on making it look that way. Partway through, he referenced a process improvement in cross-regional routing that had reduced error rates by 11% over the previous quarter. He attributed it to his team's initiative. He moved on quickly. Ryan looked at the slide and recognized the methodology. He had documented that methodology 8 months ago. He had submitted it as part of a written recommendation that had at the time generated no response. He said nothing. He wrote a single note on the paper in front of him and kept his expression neutral. Trevor Sands presented second. His numbers were solid. His framing was confident, and near the end of his segment, he made a passing comment, casual enough to seem unrehearsed, about the importance of ensuring that high-visibility roles went to people whose performance records were internally verified rather than circumstantially elevated. He didn't use Ryan's name. He didn't need to. 3 people in the room glanced toward Ryan's seat when Sands said it. Ryan kept his eyes on the table in front of him. When Ryan's turn came, he stood and presented his segment exactly as prepared. He walked through the numbers, accurately flagged the distribution concern with the same documentation he had submitted twice before, and outlined the forward projection without editorializing. He was precise, and he was brief. When he sat down, Evelyn, who had been writing steadily throughout all 3 presentations, set her pen down for the first time. She said she had a few items she wanted to address before the meeting moved forward. Her voice carried the exact same register it always did. No elevation, no edge, just the measured clarity of someone who had decided what they were going to say and had no interest in softening it for the room's comfort. She opened her folder and said that during her review of the quarter's documentation, she had identified a discrepancy between submitted work and attributed work in 2 separate cases. She named the first the cross-regional routing improvement that Marcus Hale had presented as his team's initiative. She said the methodology had been formally documented and submitted by Ryan Carter 8 months prior, with a timestamp and a distribution record that she had pulled from the system. She set the printed record on the table and slid it toward the center of the room. She named the second a logistics analysis that had been presented in a leadership summary 6 weeks ago, without attribution, which the file record showed had been authored by Ryan and submitted through proper channels 3 weeks before the summary was produced. Marcus Hale started to speak. Evelyn looked at him and said she wasn't finished. She said the pattern she had identified was not ambiguous. It was documented, time-stamped, and traceable, and she had the full record in front of her. She said the company's ability to develop strong internal talent depended entirely on that talent being recognized accurately, and that when recognition was systematically rerouted, the company didn't just lose the person, it lost the institutional capacity to identify who its actual performers were. She said this was not a minor process failure. She said she would be following up with both Marcus Hale and Trevor Sands through HR, and that the process would be formal. The room was very quiet. Evelyn closed her folder. She said the meeting could continue. Ryan looked at the table in front of him for a moment. He was not triumphant. What he felt was something closer to the strange, disorienting sensation of having a weight removed that he had been carrying long enough that he no longer noticed it. He had known what had been done to him. He had documented it carefully, and he had done nothing with the documentation because he hadn't believed that doing something with it would produce anything other than more friction. The fact that someone else had found it independently, had gone looking for it without being asked, was not something he had prepared himself to feel. After the meeting, as the room cleared, Evelyn did not come to him. She gathered her folder, spoke briefly with the HR director, who had been present, and left. Ryan packed up his materials and walked back to his desk. Dale Whitmore stopped him in the hallway and said something low and brief that he was glad it had come out that he'd been uncomfortable for weeks. Ryan thanked him and kept walking. He sat at his desk and looked at his screen. He thought about the resignation sitting in someone's inbox. He thought about whether anything had actually changed, or whether the same dynamics would reassemble themselves in a new configuration over time. He was still thinking through it when his email notification came in. It was from Evelyn's office. It said the resignation had been received, and that before it was processed, she was requesting a meeting at his earliest availability. Ryan read the message twice. He considered not responding for the rest of the day, which was a petty impulse he recognized and set aside. He wrote back and said he was available at 3 o'clock if that worked. Her office confirmed within 2 minutes. He arrived at her office exactly at 3. The door was open. She was at her desk, and she looked up when he came in and gestured to the chair across from her without formality. Ryan sat down. Evelyn set aside what she had been reading and looked at him with the same directness she brought to everything, and said that she had read the resignation and understood why he had written it, and that she was not going to ask him to withdraw it. She said that was his decision entirely, and that she would support whichever choice he made. Ryan said he appreciated that. Evelyn said she wasn't finished. She said she wanted him to know that her interest in his work had been professional and genuine, and that she was aware it had created a problem for him that he hadn't asked for and couldn't have prevented. She said that was her responsibility, not his. Ryan looked at her for a moment. He said he hadn't blamed her for it. She said she knew, and that that was part of what she wanted to address. That the fact that he hadn't blamed her, hadn't complained, hadn't used any of it as leverage, was something she had noticed, and that she didn't think people who conducted themselves that way should have to manage the consequences of other people's behavior alone. Ryan said most people didn't have the documentation to back it up the way she had found it. Evelyn said she had looked because she believed what she was likely to find. He asked her why she had believed that. She said, because in 30 years of working with people, she had learned to recognize the difference between someone who was performing integrity and someone who simply had it. Ryan was quiet for a moment after that. It was the most direct thing anyone in a professional context had said to him in a very long time, and he didn't know immediately what to do with it. He said he wasn't sure staying made things simpler. Evelyn said it probably didn't in the short term. But she said She was restructuring the project lead role that had been offered to him earlier, not as a favor, but because the role needed to exist, and he was the most qualified person for it. And she was prepared to adjust the scope so that the time demands were realistic. She said the compensation would reflect the expanded responsibility and that she had spoken with HR about a structure that accounted for the full picture. Ryan looked at her. He asked what she meant by the full picture. Evelyn said simply that she was aware he was carrying a significant financial obligation outside of work, and that it was not her business to address that directly, but that it was her business to make sure the company's compensation structure wasn't forcing one of its best people to work 3 jobs in order to stay financially viable. She said the new role, if he accepted it, would pay enough that he wouldn't need the others. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the window behind her desk at the city outside at the afternoon light, sitting flat and gray on the buildings. He had been moving at this pace for 2 years. He had been running 3 directions at once for so long that he had stopped imagining a version of his life that didn't work that way. The idea of stopping, not collapsing, not giving up, just stopping because the math finally worked, was something he had to let settle before he could respond to it. He told her he would think about it. Evelyn nodded and said that was all she was asking. Ryan stood to leave. At the door, he turned back and said that what she had done in the meeting, pulling the documentation saying it plainly in front of the room, he hadn't expected that. And he wanted her to know it had mattered. Evelyn looked at him and said, "You had already done the work. I just made sure it was readable." Ryan left. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 10 minutes before driving anywhere. He wasn't distressed. He was simply in the process of recalibrating the slow internal adjustment of a person whose circumstances have shifted enough that their old operating assumptions no longer apply. He had walked into that building this morning, prepared to leave it permanently. He was leaving with something he hadn't arrived with, and he needed a moment to understand what it was. He withdrew the resignation that evening. The weeks that followed were not simple, but they were different. Marcus Hale and Trevor Sands both went through formal HR processes, the outcomes of which were not announced broadly, but were visible enough in the reorganization that followed. The operations floor settled into a different rhythm, less guarded, less performative. Ryan took the project lead role. He restructured his schedule for the first time in 2 years and gave up the rideshare shifts and the overnight delivery runs, not all at once, but gradually, as the new income made each one unnecessary. The last rideshare shift he worked was on a Saturday morning, and he sat in the quiet of his car afterward, in the parking lot of a coffee shop, and felt the particular stillness of something ending that had run its course. His father's debt did not disappear overnight, but it had a clear timeline now which was different from the open-ended wait it had been before. Knowing when something ends changes how it sits in your body. Chloe was still figuring out her own direction, but something had shifted in her too. She had watched Ryan navigate the worst weeks of the office situation with a steadiness she hadn't seen modeled very often, and it had given her a different idea of what it looked like to carry difficulty without losing your footing. She had started seeing a therapist, a decision she'd arrived at on her own, and mentioned to her mother one evening over dinner without drama, just as a fact. Evelyn had said she thought that was a good idea. The two of them ate the rest of the meal in a quieter ease than most of their dinners allowed. The relationship that formed between Ryan and Evelyn afterward was not easy to categorize, which was fine, because neither of them tried. They were not friends in the casual sense of the word. They were two people who had seen each other clearly under pressure, and who had developed, because of that, a specific kind of trust that didn't need frequent maintenance. They talked when there was something worth talking about. They respected what the other was managing. They didn't require anything from each other that the other hadn't offered freely. There was one evening several months into the new structure when Ryan stayed late to finish a project brief and found Evelyn still at her desk when he passed her office. She had a cup of cold coffee and a look on her face that suggested the day had been longer than even she had planned for. He knocked on the open door and asked if she'd eaten. She said she hadn't. He said he was heading out, and that there was a decent place 2 blocks over that stayed open late. She looked at him for a moment, with the evaluating expression he had come to know, then picked up her jacket. They walked out of the building together and ate at a small table by the window and talked about the project and the restructuring and eventually about something that had nothing to do with work at all. It was the first time that had happened. It felt in the way that true things often do, like something that had been building for a long time and had simply arrived. Ryan drove home that night through the late city streets without the app running, without a delivery bag in the back seat, without the mental arithmetic of what the next few hours needed to produce. The streets were the same. The city was the same. But the weight in the car was different. He noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you've been hearing so long it became part of the air, not with relief exactly, but with the quiet recognition that something has finally resolved. He had not set out to find anything that morning months ago when he'd pulled over for a drunk girl outside a bar. He had just done the thing in front of him. And somehow, in the middle of all of it, the debt and the early mornings, and the slow erosion, and the folder on a conference room table, that small, unremarkable decision had opened something up. Not a door, exactly. More like a window. Enough to let in air. Enough to make the room livable again.